You look in the mirror today, maybe worrying about calories. You want to be thin. In the Middle Ages, thin meant you were poor, sick, and about to die. Sexy wasn't a flat stomach, it was a thick layer of body fat. The ideal body was a survivable body. Their entire diet wasn't about taste, it was a desperate, high-calorie race to build that life-saving insulation. You're about to discover why fat was the ultimate status symbol of wealth and fertility. Their existence was a constant struggle for warmth, food, and ultimately life. The interior rooms were cold, drafts were the norm, and windows, if they existed at all, were covered not with glass, but with thin, oiled leather. They lived in conditions that modern people cannot even imagine. No electricity, no central heating, no thermos flasks or down jackets. They had no choice but to adapt. Their survival techniques, their ingenuity, and their resilience were the result of a daily struggle. These were people who didn't just live, they survived every day. They learned to make the most of the least, to use every resource to the last crumb. Watch until the end, and you'll find out why their dirty winter diet was more thoughtful than ours, and why every log they saved was more important than hundreds of dollars in our bank accounts. Winter in the Middle Ages did not arrive suddenly, as if at the snap of a finger, but crept up gradually, giving time to prepare. Its harbingers were short, cloudy days, and piercing cold winds that made you shiver with every breath. Long before the first snow, when the ground had not yet frozen, everyone who was strong enough to hold an axe set off for the nearby forest. Firewood gathering was not just a duty or a routine, but a sacred vital ritual on which the survival of the entire community depended. It was painstaking and exhausting work that began long before the onset of cold weather and required enormous effort. Every year, so much wood was needed that it is difficult for modern people to imagine. The quantities were enormous. Even a small castle, let alone a large one, consumed tons of wood, which meant that work had to be done incessantly. These were not just piles of logs that were thrown down haphazardly, but carefully selected, chopped, dried, and carefully stacked logs. The entire process took many months, starting in early spring when it was easier to chop, and continuing until late autumn when it had to be finished before the first frost turned the ground to stone. In summer, when the days were long and hot, the logs were chopped, cleaned of branches and bark, and then split. It was extremely hard physical work, involving not only adult men, but also women, and even children who helped carry branches and smaller logs. They worked from dawn to dusk without days off or breaks, because they knew that every extra log meant an extra day of warmth, and every extra day of warmth meant a life saved from the cold. The wood was not all the same. Oak and beech, being hardwoods, gave off a lot of heat and burned for a long time, smoldering slowly. But they were difficult to chop, then split and carry over long distances. This was the luxury wood, often reserved for the lord's chambers. Spruce and pine burned quickly with crackling and sparks, but gave off a lot of resin and soot, which settled on the walls and in the respiratory tract, causing constant coughing. You'd cough up black phlegm. An experienced woodcutter knew which species were best suited for the main hearth and which were best for kindling. They worked all day, until the first frost began. This was the raw measure of a man, not his looks, but the size of his woodpile. A man with a massive stack of wood was a symbol of raw provider status, the ideal husband who could keep his family alive. The felled trees were dried under shelters to prevent rot and mold, and to preserve maximum energy. Improperly dried wood could ruin the entire winter, giving off little heat and filling the room with smoke. It was a kind of economy where the main commodity was not bread, but firewood, and their quality determined the very existence of the community. When the wood was ready, it was carefully stored. Wood piles were carefully planned and organized to ensure maximum preservation. The logs were stacked so that there was a gap between them for air to circulate, allowing the wood to breathe. This helped keep the wood dry and prevent it from rotting. Sometimes firewood was even stored inside the castle in special utility rooms, so that it was always close at hand. Their life was an endless cycle of planning. They knew that the slightest mistake in summer would result in hunger and cold in winter. The wood stores were always kept in strict order. Sometimes the most valuable dry wood intended for heating the master's quarters was stored separately under lock and key. This supply was sacred. Preparing firewood was not just physical labor, but also a complex logistical task requiring strategic thinking. They had to not only chop the wood, but also store it properly. It was a constant battle with nature. What do you think would be more difficult? Earning money to heat your home for the whole winter, or, like them, cutting tons of firewood yourself? The castle's stone walls, thick and massive, were excellent protection against external enemies, but poor protection against the cold. Stone conducted cold perfectly, and the interior rooms were frozen through. The only source of heat was a fireplace, which was lit in the main hall. The hearth could not heat the entire castle, only a small part, and the heat quickly dissipated. People gathered in one or more rooms where there was a fire. These were large halls, sometimes even kitchens. But fire was only part of the solution, and drafts were the main cause of all the trouble. Cold air penetrated through cracks in the walls, under doors, and through small windows, which were often covered not with glass, but with oiled leather. This is where the huddling began. 40, 50, 60. People, soldiers, servants, family, all crushed together in one room, sleeping on the floor just to share body heat. The smell of unwashed bodies, sweat, and fear, all mingling. That was the price of not freezing to death. To combat this, people used everything at hand. Fabric curtains, massive tapestries, and carpets were hung on the walls to insulate the room from the frozen stones. They not only added warmth, but were also a symbol of status. The richer the castle, the more tapestries there were. Beds also played their part. They were often raised on a platform so that the cold air that descended would not cool the sleepers. In addition, there was a canopy made of thick fabric above them. This canopy was not a decorative element, but a kind of tent inside the room, creating its own microclimate. It helped to retain the heat that a person generated during the night. Thus, a person slept in a kind of mini-house inside a huge, cold room. This was a true space, a warm, moist, slightly suffocating cocoon where your breath, and the breath of anyone you pulled in with you, was trapped. It didn't just trap warmth, it trapped every body odor, every smell of sweat, and every fart. That was the price of warmth. Sometimes beds were even placed near the hearth to get the maximum amount of heat, but this was not available to everyone. The floors were also insulated. They were covered with a thick layer of straw, which not only served as insulation from the icy stone, but also collected dirt, making cleaning easier since it was easier to replace the straw than to wash the floor. Finally, the walls were plastered with clay and moss to seal even the smallest crack. But let's talk about that straw. Straw wasn't just a material, it was an ecosystem. Straw was used to make mattresses and bedding. This is where you were born, in blood and amniotic fluid. This is where you had furtive, hurried sex. This is where your children wet the bed. This is where you sweat, got sick, and vomited. And this is where you died, breathing your last. That straw pile was a giant sponge for every bodily fluid imaginable, a paradise for fleas, lice, and bedbugs. Its smell, a mixture of old sweat, mildew, and urine. That was the smell of life. Medieval castles were a kind of microcosm where every resource was of great importance and used to the last. Their survival was based entirely on the principle of zero waste. No material was thrown away as everything had its price. Straw, as mentioned, was bedding for livestock, insulation, and the mattress for humans. Another important resource was wool. Wool sheared from sheep was used for clothing, warm blankets, and even for insulating windows. When there was not enough wool, leather and fur were used for warmth, taken from slaughtered animals. Even bird feathers collected during hunting were put to good use. They were used to make duvets and pillows. In addition, people used charcoal, a luxury, and pork fat. Pork fat was like gold. It was melted down and poured into special molds to make candles. This fat was so valuable, it was saved for essential purposes. These candles not only provided light, allowing people to go about their business after sunset, but also gave off a little heat and helped dry the air. Every part of the animal was used. In winter, the diet changed dramatically. There were no fresh vegetables or fruits. Their diet consisted mainly of salted meat, fish, and dried vegetables, as well as grains. This wasn't just food, it was fuel. The medieval diet was very high in calories and fat, which was necessary to stay warm. The logic: your body is a furnace, and fat is the firewood. Getting fat was not an insult, it was the explicit goal. A thick, fatted body was a body that could survive the winter. A skinny woman was seen as frail, infertile, and weak. A woman with flesh, with fat, with wide hips for fat storage and childbirth was the icon of health and sensuality. Fatty soups and stews cooked over a slow fire were not only delicious, but also vital. They helped the body generate heat and maintain body temperature. People ate a lot and often to keep from freezing and weakening. They made thick bean soups with lard, which provided the body with the fats and proteins it needed. Smoked fish and meat, salted to the point of being inedible, were the basis of their diet, as they could be stored for a long time without refrigeration. You cannot imagine the saltiness. Meat had to be soaked for hours, even days, just to be palatable. These preservation methods like salting, smoking, and drying were their only insurance against starvation. Alcohol also played a role. Beer and wine, diluted and undiluted, helped to warm up by dilating blood vessels, a false but comforting feeling. They were not only drinks, but also additional sources of calories and energy. In addition, they were often used for disinfection, safer than dirty well water, and as a remedy for colds. However, despite all these tricks, food supplies were not endless. What did they do when food supplies ran out and winter was just beginning? Clothing was not just a fashion statement, but a multi-layered survival system. It was a complex mechanism of protection from the environment, where each layer had its own specific purpose. In an era with no central heating, clothing served as a personal, mobile fortress, protecting against the bitter cold. This complex system allowed body temperature to be regulated, preventing overheating and hypothermia, which was especially important when performing heavy physical work. The inner layer, usually made of linen, had a critical function, wicking away sweat. If you wore wool directly against your skin, you would sweat. The wool would hold the moisture, and the cold would kill you from the inside out. Wet sweat was a death sentence. You were wearing a death trap. The linen layer absorbed the sweat, keeping the skin dry. This was critically important because if sweat remained on the skin, it would quickly cool down, leading to hypothermia. The next layer, made of wool, retained heat. Thanks to its structure, wool created air pockets that effectively trapped heat. It was the ideal choice for the second layer. Even when wet, wool continued to retain heat. The outer layer could be made of thick fabric or even leather to protect against wind and rain. In addition, people wore thick stockings, gloves, and hats. These accessories were not just additions, but vital elements. Frostbite of the fingers, nose, or ears was common and could lead to amputation. Clothes were bulky and uncomfortable. A person dressed in such layers resembled a clumsy bear. And the inconvenience? Try going to the bathroom. You had to wrestle with 5 to 7 layers of clothing and belts while the cold was cutting your bare skin. On particularly cold nights, people slept in their clothes, wrapped in blankets and animal skins. No sexy nightgowns, just survival. You slept in the same clothes you had worn, sweated in, and worked in all day. Hygiene in the Middle Ages was, to put it mildly, peculiar. Don't imagine frequent bathing. Castles did not have running water, and people had to carry water from wells or streams, which required enormous effort. It was hard and monotonous work, taking a lot of time and energy, especially during the cold season. In winter, it was especially difficult because the water froze. Sometimes it was necessary to break thick ice to get to the water or melt snow over the hearth, which required a lot of precious fuel. Water was for drinking and cooking. Bathing, an extreme luxury, perhaps not done for months. Imagine the body odor, trapped under 7 layers of wool and leather for weeks. To avoid disease, people tried to maintain relative cleanliness as much as possible. They intuitively understood that filth and extreme unpleasant odors could be associated with disease. They tried to wash their hands before eating, but there was not always enough water. They washed in large bathhouses where water was heated in huge boilers. These bathhouses were rare and usually located in cities or wealthy castles. This was not just a process of cleansing, but a real social event. And it was an openly space. Men and women, sometimes separated, sometimes not, would be nude together in the hot steam, relaxing, gossiping, and most importantly, getting warm. That was the main goal. The only time in weeks they felt warmth seep into their bones. But what did they do when the frost came and the water in the well froze? How did they cope when there was no fire, no water, and even drinking water was at risk? In winter, when it was cold and dark outside, people spent a lot of time indoors, trying to keep warm and not get bored. The short days and long cold nights forced people to find activities that could be done in the warmth of their homes. It was a time when the whole family gathered together. Storytelling was one of the main entertainments. People told legends about heroes, fairy tales about magic, and myths about gods, which were passed down orally. It was a way to keep spirits high and not go crazy from the monotony. These stories not only entertained, but also educated, and often included crude details about sex, violence, and bodily functions to keep everyone's attention. This was their Netflix. Music and dancing were an integral part. In castles, lavish balls and feasts were held. In simple villages, people sang folk songs. Music and dancing brought people together, creating an atmosphere of joy and unity, helping to cope with the cold and loneliness. What do you think about this part of history? What realities of another era would you like me to expose next? Leave a comment and subscribe so you don't miss it. What do you think about this part of history? What realities of another era would you like me to expose next? Leave a comment and subscribe so you don't miss it. So survival in medieval castles was not an easy test, but a daily struggle for life. The people who lived at that time were resourceful, resilient, and incredibly hardy. They learned to make the most of the least, to use every resource to the last crumb, and to help each other. Their lives were marked by harsh realities, but at the same time, they were filled with simple joys, such as the warmth of the hearth, food, and the raw connection with loved ones. They did not wait for a miracle. They created their own survival, relying only on their strength and knowledge. Their story is a story of how humanity survived in conditions that seem impossible to us today.